Okay, is Canada ready for World War III? Well, I guess the short answer is no. Nobody will be really ready for that. Now, this video is going to probably get some people, uh, you know, heated debate, I'm sure, going because of, perceptions, patriotism, and then of course there's just other other things to factor in. We're going to be talking basically a conventional war, not necessarily a full-out nuclear war, because no one's going to be able to really deal with that. But leading up to it, now with Ukraine about to, some say they will never get into NATO, but and there's a reason why they can't bring Ukraine into NATO right now, because that's instant war because of Article 5. Article 5 under NATO, basically, attack against one is attack against them all, meaning if they're with the U.S. propaganda and Canadian propaganda and British propaganda and everywhere else, from the EU, from the IMF, from the, what this really is about is, basically the EU, IMF Rothschild bankers basically having control over, the Ukraine. But it's also about the strategy of basically NATO expansion into Ukraine. And with that, NATO expansion into Ukraine surrounds Russia's borders. It's also to destroy the manufacturing of weapons that Ukraine was making for Russia and other things. Plus, it's a war against the economy, the Russian economy, and stuff like that. So you get the idea. It's your typical war in all fronts. Now, with Canada here, okay, the battlefield between Russia, China, and the U.S. automatically defaults, whether we were a part of NATO or not, will automatically default Canada as the battleground. During NORAD in the 1950s, we had several interceptors up north known as the CF-100s. They were basically a Canadian-designed all-weather aircraft that it was kind of like a fighter interceptor type of thing, more of an interceptor. It had good climb rate, although it was a straight-winged aircraft. It was about the only aircraft that NATO could rely on because it was the only one that was had a 2,000-mile range and all-weather. So while other airplanes like the F-86 Sabre were better at dogfighting and stuff, the CF-100 was a really good patrol aircraft. And of course, at first it had rockets and cannons, like 20 millimeter cannons, and then later on it would incorporate air-to-air missiles. And these things served right up to 1986. Okay, and by that time too, there was the frontline fighter was the CF-101 Voodoo. And then after that came the CF-18s, which we have now. But the thing is our newest airplane, our newest CF-18 is basically 30 years old, pretty much. So there's kind of problems. Now we have these Alpha jets now. We have about 100 of them on loan from France. I don't think we're going to outright buy them, but we also have about another 100, 100 CT 155 Hawks as well, which is a BAE British Hawk basically, and they can be used as like short range interceptors. Although they're not a high capability airplane in the sense of for ground attacks and mass payloads, they could be a hell of a dogfighter. And not to mention, we still have probably the CF 116, which was really basically an F5, but the Canadian variant of it, made by Canada Air. Canada Air made most of our combat aircraft, not all of them, but a good, like the F-86 Sabre. That was the most numerous jet we ever had, fighter jet we ever had in Canada, was the F-86 Sabre with about 1,800 of them. And then, of course, CF-18s now are about 120 to 140. There's a lot of them that, a few have crashed. Some of them are now parts planes. Many of them have been upgraded in 2003. But with that, we're still waiting on the next generation fighter. The problem is the replacement. The numbers keep getting lower as the technology goes up. The replacement numbers get lower. For example, when we do get the F-35, as controversial as that airplane is, we're replacing basically 140 airplanes with 65. So this is not good. This is not good at all. The Navy. We have 4 submarines, 2 of which that are actually being used. They do about 100 days of service every year. Although the Upholder class Victoria Upholder class submarines have been quite controversial. Again, now that they're working, they work quite well, but there's still a lot of problems. I mean, we took basically submarines that sat about a decade in salt water without maintenance, and pretty much had to rebuild them from the ground up. And there was also other problems, such as they didn't have the right torpedoes, so we had to we rebuilt the airplanes and had to kind of put in new torpedoes. We used to have aircraft carriers. We do not anymore. most of the old airplanes, such as the Voodoo and stuff like that, there's still there's still a few of them kicking around, but most of them are just air show. And same with the CF-104 starfighters. Most of these things were basically most of them are now gate guards or have been pretty much chopped up. So the bulk of the Canadian Air Force is mostly helicopters and heavy lift. Like yeah, I believe at one point the numbers changed too, especially under the conservative government that we have now, which isn't technically a conservative government, but we'll call them a conservative government. Um, they're more socialist fascist in their policies, but they basically, in a nutshell, basically have done more for the Canadian military than any other government in history. The Canadian military has never had access to the training and equipment it's had. Now they have been making cutbacks for the 2015 budget, but even at that, we're upgrades on just about everything, plus the new equipment that we're getting. Um, the thing is with the heavy lift, most of our heavy lift are going to be uh, you know uh, C the C-130 Hercules, and stuff like that. Now with those, they're I think a better choice of airplane for Canada for a lot of reasons. Although they can't really move the extremely heavy stuff like tanks and stuff like that. That's where the the Globe Master basically is better for that type of stuff. Now, with that said, we if we're talking just taking on the Russians, I mean we're talking about a military that's about 4 to 5 times larger than us personnel wise. Okay. Now we're also talking about tanks and stuff where we have about 200 Leopard tanks of different variations. Although I say our tanks are superior in a lot of ways, we use like the 2A4, the 2A6. We have a lot of C2s left over that have been upgraded, so that they're not completely superior to the T-72s that will be outnumbering it. They're superior in a lot of ways, but with the upgrades, the Russians have, they got good stuff. It's not amazing stuff, but it's good stuff. But they just have so much of it that's where the real problem is. That said, so tanks alone, I think one on one, I would definitely put the hands down to the Canadian crews because after talking to some tankers, I mean these things are just beasts. Number one, even talking to and one of my viewers who was a T-72 tanker who went up against a Leopard, and he said it took 5 shots just to stop the darn thing. So they got lucky and they took out the main gun on the first shot, and then as they got in closer. So it's not that, and this was an old Leopard 1 or Leopard 2, I think he said. The Leopards now the Leopard tanks now are the armor is like 10 times superior than what it used to be. Very mobile tank, very powerful, and of course the firepower to match. So in that sense, they're going to be pretty good. It's just the numbers are low. You're talking 200. Now in armored personnel carriers such as LAVs, M113s, stuff like that, we have a whole bunch of variations of these things. So basically, we're looking at about 700 to 900 LAV type because there's a lot of them that are no longer used anymore. And then, of course, with the M113s, at one point we had 1,100 of them. I think we have about 200 of them that they kind of upgraded in a couple of years ago in 2006, 2007, that type of thing. Don't quote me on the year, but somewhere around that. Now, the types of things they could throw on there, obviously coaxial machine guns are good against, light targets, but, they also have, for example, on the LAVs, tow missile systems. We have the M109s. We have about 100 to 200 of those, although they don't get used as much anymore. Submarines, again, even though they're, I think we should put much more effort into our submarine fleets, but we only have 2 of those. Naval warships, you're looking at 3 destroyers that are currently left. One is badly damaged. One has been sunk. We had 4 tribal class destroyers, and then we have one that's retired and one remaining in service. And I think it's the Athabascan or the Iroquois. That's one of those 2 retired last year, because they're going to be replacing these things probably within the next 2 years. And those are mostly air superiority. Air defense type of thing. They have the Sea Sparrow and the Tomahawk missile, as well as other things. They carry a fair amount, like up to 29 missiles or whatever. So it's a good amount of firepower. Now, plus the Oto 76mm deck gun is what's on our main destroyer. Now, that in itself, I would say, in comparison to the massive firepower of some of the Russian, battle cruisers that they have out there and destroyers, again, the Russian Navy is larger than ours. they have probably about 200 submarines that they could put in service. They keep about 100 of them. You know, the bulk of the Russian Navy is going to be submarines. So they have about 200 warships that they keep on tabs. Us, if you add up our destroyers, we're looking at 4, with only 2 that can be back into service, because the other one that got at Rimpack, it got into a bad accident, and it's not worthwhile fixing right now. You have to understand, these are old ships. Even though they were upgraded in 2003, they're in need of replacement. The frigates that we have are basically, we have 12 of those, and then we have 12 what you call it, yeah, 12 frigates, and then 12 minesweepers, and then 12 trading vessels, with a total of about 66 naval vessels. This includes Coast Guard and everything for the Canadian Navy. Helicopters, well, the old Labrador helicopters are pretty much out of commission. Who knows how many of them they could probably ever resurrect, but they've been pretty much replaced by the Chinook anyway. And you're looking at about, don't quote me on the number for Chinooks, but I think about 100 or 200 of those. So we can move people around pretty good that way. The Griffin helicopters, which in Afghanistan they were known as the go-to guys, because these guys basically, you had a 50 caliber machine gunner on one side of the helicopter, and you had a Dillon minigun on the other side of the helicopter, and these guys would just come in real low and real fast in the high mountains and just basically maneuver all over the place and basically slaughter Taliban. You know, like they were shooting groundhogs basically. These guys got it called in for close support quite a bit. Now that helicopter is old, and there's about 500 of those. I don't know how many we keep in active service, but there's about 500 of those. Now, with the new Cormorants, I think there was like 36 of those. The last time I counted, there might be a little bit more now. You know, basically, for example, let's forget the name of this aircraft. This is basically, it's an Airbus, and it basically has the capability of being used as a transport, cargo, or air fueler. As well as we have what's known as the CP-140 Aurora, and there's about 21 of those, and these are basically our electronic warfare aircraft, mainly sub-hunters and maritime patrol, but they can use basically anything the P-8 Orion can, any so you're talking harpoon missiles, probably HARM anti-radiation missiles, any sort of probably GBU, as well as the Mark 48 torpedoes and the Mark 54 and the Mark 46. I don't know about the Mark 48s because those are pretty heavy, but I think it can lift those. And they have, you know, long. Plus, it has electronic warfare capabilities, so they, you know, they're pretty good for what they are. Again, low numbers. This is our biggest problem: is we have excellent stuff, but it's low numbers. The Russian stuff is a lot more fancy. You know, there's more, you know, stuff is more kind of Spartan, gunny looking, that type of thing. ADATs, somebody said there was only 4 of them. I think there was like 30 of them, but they probably only have 4 in active duty, because you have to understand, when these numbers bounce around all the time because of that. You know, for example, we have 100 Leopard tanks that we use, but we really have 200, you know, and at one point I think we had like 500, so a lot of them are just decommissioned, so you don't know what's sitting there in mothballs either, you know, like you have a good idea, but even with that, like for example M113s, you can, you know, if there's 2 in service, there's probably a lot we've sold, there's probably a lot we've you know, revamped, but there's also a lot too that you know, are just sitting there in mothballs that could be, you know, put back into service again in various different convention, you know, setups. So with that, it's kind of hard to say exactly what we have, you know. And plus, you know, every time we replace something with something else, you know, we don't count it anymore, so to speak. The other thing is the maritime patrol helicopters pretty much have about 30. We have about 30 Sea Kings, which are being replaced by the Cyclones, which are basically quite another controversial. Procurement has always been a problem with Canadian military purchases. We buy stuff that either never gets delivered, or we buy stuff that when it gets delivered, it's not as advertised, that type of thing. So right now we only have, I think, 1 or 2 Cyclones on loan. We're waiting for the rest to show up. So unfortunately, we're still using the Sea King as our backbone maritime patrol helicopter. Other helicopters such as the Kiowa, these things could be used as light attack aircraft as well. I don't know exactly how many Kiowas we have, probably around 500, but I can imagine, like, again, like anything, Many of them are old, so that's why we have so many. But a lot of them get upgraded with FLIR systems. One variation has the 20 millimeter hanging off the side of it there, and you can also fire the Hydra rockets off of it. So I mean, you can bust tanks with that. It's just the helicopters themselves are not really designed to take heavy, heavy anti-aircraft. Other things such as like the Havilland Otters and Beavers and stuff like that. So we've got all kinds of patrol aircraft that are not necessarily military looking. They're more kind of, you'd say almost second line kind of military looking. Training wise, whatever the Americans train, that's pretty much what we train. We do it a little bit differently. I remember, again, for those of you who don't know, I did try to join the military quite a bit of times when I was younger. But back in the time, we weren't at war with like 50 billion countries, so it was pretty much one of those things that you know they they were picky. You wanted to get into the Canadian military, good luck. The best thing you could get was a field gunner. Now the field gunner is basically artillery. Now we use the 777 M777 artillery, which is pretty state of the art. Like they basically could have what you call it. They can track where the shell lands, and so they can get pretty darn precise. And I've talked to quite a few field gunners, and the ones that you got to speak up when you're talking to these guys, because the guys that actually enjoy it. There's me, my nephew. I don't know how he gets in there all the time. He shows up everywhere. Actually, he just left the house there. So anyway, but anyway, the thing is that these field gunners, I mean, they're telling me some of the stuff like they're basically launching artillery into pop cans type of thing. Maybe not that accurate. They're accurate within 15, 20 meters of their target, but a lot of times this is when they begin. But he says they get down to like pinpoint accurate after a while. Through the training, of course. So it's like there was an artillery crew in Afghanistan, and they had a guy in a little hut or whatever that was, basically sniping people out. And they knew where he was, and they knew he was the only guy in there. And basically, they called in for artillery support. They gave the coordinates, and they said, he's in the window. He says, "What's the coordinates for the window?" And they put the artillery shell through the window from, with the 105 millimeter guns. So, I mean, these guys do know what they're doing. I'm not trying to brag them up, but I mean, they know what they're doing. Like anything, you fight like you train like you fight. So artillery, I think, is something that Canada doesn't have as much of as we used to. But was something that we, ever since World War One, artillery was something that Canada was always understood the importance of artillery, and no more than after Korea that we really understood the importance of artillery when you're outnumbered. It's one of the best things to. It's low tech, high tech now, where it's still a simple concept. You're taking a projectile, putting a massive charge behind it, and just doing calculations to make sure the payload lands where it's supposed to. And that's one of the things that I think, even if Afghanistan, there was a lot of artillery guys there that did really well. But in World War One, maybe you know this, maybe you don't. The opening shots of World War One were fired with Canadian artillery, and it was the largest artillery barrage in history. 1,050 artillery guns at once. I'm sure most of them were probably like 18 pounders or whatever, but still, that's a hell of a lot of artillery. So with that said, it gives you an idea of some of the stuff we have. Now, the other thing is we do, because we have so much joint U.S.-Canada kind of cooperation, a lot of technology, too, we do double back on with the Americans, particularly during NORAD, like the NORAD type stuff. And then, of course, we've got, very satellite-oriented we'll see the Russians coming long before they get here, type of thing. That said, one of the major things that the Russians and the Chinese are learning how to target is satellites, because they know how dependent the U.S. is on it, and of course Canada will be. Fighter aircraft, again, the way the CF-18 pilots train, these guys are pretty good. The CF-18 is a bit of an old airplane, but it's different than the FA-18. We have different engines in them. We kind of take, and this is common with Canadian military as well, take something that was from the U.S. and then we'll hot rod it to our specifications. So we, because you have to understand, for the U.S., the F-18 is basically their bargain airplane that was supposed to, basically replace a bunch of airplanes, so that, particularly the F-14, which was much more expensive to run. And so it wasn't really considered a frontline fighter for the first longest time. Now it is, because they've hot rodded them enough. But thing is we started off as that was our frontline fighter, When we first got them, they were an 800 mile an hour aircraft. Now they're well over 1400 mile an hour aircraft because of the the extra stuff we did. But the problem is too is they're still getting old. So other things to consider is that even with all the artillery, all that, even being heavily outnumbered, one of the main advantages of, and this is why I'm kind of against foreign intervention, is that it's a lot easier to protect the castle. Again, taking a beachhead, is, even if you have superior numbers, it's that beach landing is the hardest thing to ever do. It's one of the most dangerous things a military can do. So having artillery is strategically put along the coast is probably, you probably won't need as much as you think, as long as you have enough guys to keep feeding the gun and don't cook the barrel, that type of thing. Other things is, our supply ships. I guess both supply ships right now are the Procurer and the Protector are both out of commission. One caught fire, the other one is pretty much retired, and they're not worthwhile upgrading at this point because we're probably going to be again having new ships within 2016 to 2018. We're going to start seeing new ships. We've already seen the Hero class Coast Guard vessels show up. They're a nice looking vessel too. Other things is, and this is one of the things you'll see that they really try to bogus. It's very typical Canadian. It's like, if you ever watch an armed forces video, okay, you'll see the officers come on and they'll say, join the Canadian Armed Forces because you'll, pick a career, you'll do this and you'll do that, and everything will be wonderful and you'll be so proud of yourself. And then they start interviewing the recruits, and almost half the recruits will say the same thing. Well, I wanted to challenge myself and that, but I really just wanted to blow shit up. No said. That is a very Canadian attitude to have. I just wanted to blow shit up. And you'll hear that like almost every second recruit says it. It's pretty funny. So I never did get into the military because, again, at the time, I didn't have my grade 10, and you needed your grade 10 just to be a field gunner. Now they'll take anything for cannon fodder. I would never join the military now, just knowing what the geopolitics are. To me, I would always say protect my own country, but the thing is that unfortunately we have madmen that control the militaries, which unfortunately get a lot of good soldiers killed for no reason. That said, I know the Canadian military is outgunned in a lot of ways, numbers-wise, by the Russians. And the Russians do have some pretty good stuff, but I still say that I'd lean the technology edge to the Canadians. However, the only thing is we don't have nukes. Not that we're not capable of making them. In fact, if anybody can make nukes, it's going to be us, because not only can we enrich uranium, but we have tons and tons of uranium around. We're one of the number one manufacturers of miners of uranium. We mainly do it but we chose not to make weapons with it, although we probably sell the uranium to allied countries to make weapons for, such as the United States and stuff like that. But again, time and time again, when you look at historical Canadian battles, whether World War I, World War II, World War II, whichever, North Korea, there's always been a lot of scenarios where Canadians have been heavily outnumbered and have done really well. And there's Dieppe, which was complete disaster. But I think it was a disaster on purpose. They were basically cannon fodder so that they could steal an Enigma code machine. That's what they say it was for. But like anything, it could have just been a blunder too. But that said, the legendary stuff that Canadians have done, in battle, being outgunned and stuff like that. And even in Afghanistan, one of the things that, the Russians always said is they hated the idea of fighting Canadians because we never stick to our training manuals. We're always trying to trick people. We do fight kind of dirty, But again, if you're outgunned and you're outnumbered, yeah. Now, the little ADAT system is not a bad system. I'm sure the Russians have a lot of countermeasures for this thing. But these things are not just air defense anymore. They also can shoot an anti-tank missile, which would also be anti-amphibious vehicles as well, ships, what have you. So those things, again, we only have 4 that we use right now, but at one point I think we had like 30 of them. That, again, low in numbers is a big problem. Now, where I think Canada would be do really well is in the foot soldier category, and here's why. Because the typical Russian soldier although fairly well equipped, they're they still have older stuff, in comparison. For example, we use the M72 rocket launcher, which is old. Don't get me wrong, it's old, but it's that thing can punch through 300 millimeters of armor. You know, I think that's pretty good. It might not be enough to completely destroy a T-72, but if you can blow a track off, that thing's a sitting duck, right? And I think in those type of things, plus we have other things. What's the name of our anti-tank missile? Oh, Earnux, so, something like that. Anyway, it's good up to 600 meters. It'll punch through about 600 millimeters of armor as well. So we do have good weapons. We have drone technology as well. Drones, in fact, I think is something that is relatively new for Canadians. Again, we're very modernized military. It's just we're small. We're talking about 25,000 soldiers, about 300,000 personnel all in. Most of our soldiers are sitting at desks. This was one of the complaints of the government, saying there's too much tail and not enough teeth. But we do have a lot of stuff that we are good at. We do have, for example, for maritime patrol, one of the things we do is we have this cable. And this is typical of any minesweeper or frigate or anything like that. We have cables that hang off the back of our submarines, and well, they don't hang off, but they're quite well hooked up off the submarines and off the minesweepers, and basically they go several kilometers out, and they're basically microphones. And they can lay down microphones to listen for submarines and stuff like that. So we're you don't need as much high tech stuff as you would think, as long as like anything, if you know they're coming, you can get them. You know what I mean? So obviously we have hovercraft and stuff like that. Most of the stuff that is Coast Guard. We have a lot of our Arctic stuff. This is like our new special kind of Arctic snowmobile type of thing. So we have a lot of stuff that is still pretty potent. Again, the big thing with the Russians is that they have a lot of, even the older stuff, they have so much of it. So the biggest problem we have is the numbers. The technology is pretty good. The radar is pretty good. I think we're a little bit light on the attack aircraft. I think Canada would be probably better off to scrap the F-35s and buy about 500 A-10s. The A-10, I think, is the unsung hero of the U.S. Air Force. It really is. It's the most useful airplane they've got. If you had 500 Apaches and 500 A-10s, and then even a handful, even 200 air superiority machines, I think you'd be pretty well covered. So what we're doing is we got basically the CF-18 is our jack of all trades aircraft. Now, how does that compare to the Su-27, the Su-35, and the MiG-29s and stuff? Well, I think, like anything, with the look-down, shoot-down systems that we have, the same way, almost every modern combat aircraft from all nations have look-down, shoot-down system. So maneuverability is a plus. Don't get me wrong, but it's to the point now where most of these dogfights would be settled within seconds. I think the time it takes the missile to launch. That's pretty much it. The thing is and even Russian pilots said, they were talking about American aircraft, but because our aircraft are pretty much the same, they were talking about how, this is an older documentary, but saying that, I would never want to see an F-18 meet up with a MiG-29 in the sky, because it would just be disastrous for the two pilots. Both are really good airplanes, and they are. Is one slightly, like the what you call it, the Su-35, is it superior to the CF-18? In many, many ways, yes. I would say in roll rate, no. The CF-18, I think, would, in that sense, is much more of a zippy airplane. In engine power, yes. In altitude, probably, definitely. But even with that, I think the better pilot would win. Again, our CF-18s are pretty, they're pretty good. They're pretty good. It's the pilot training, I think, that makes more of the difference. And that's something where I think training is where Canadians have a little bit more of an edge over the Russians. Is the Russians tend to have more numbers, but we tend to have more consistent training. So that, I think, goes, again, you can't completely dismiss it and overlook it. I don't think a long scale war would work out well for Canada at all because, well, it's not going to work out for anybody. But the Russians would take massive losses trying to invade Canada. It doesn't mean they wouldn't try. Uh, you know, again, they would go after the technology first. Satellites, that type of thing, radar, forward radar, that type of thing. Uh, Now the thing is they can't come through Canada without attacking, without Alaska. NORAD up there in Alaska, springing to into action. Oh, also plus we have lots of anti-mine and stuff like that vehicles as well. Um, so we're not badly equipped. Now our special forces guys. Now the Russian Spetsnaz versus our special forces guys. Um, the Spetsnaz are a different breed of people altogether, as they do tend to be pretty hardcore. But our special forces guys tend to be, how would you say it? Like, I would say the Spetsnaz guys are more of a brute stick, and I would say our special forces guys are more of a surgical scalpel. So they're both extremely effective. I don't know who would get the upper hand in that one. I really don't, because um, again, whoever falls into whoever sights first, I think would be the toast. Our snipers, for example, that's one thing that we do have really good snipers. Some of the best top snipers in the world are Canadian. Now, of course, with Russia after World War II, almost all the top 500 snipers are Russian. And the top sniper in the world is actually from Finland. Using a Russian rifle, but you get the idea that, as modern militaries go, we do have pretty good snipers and stuff like that. Again, all our special forces guys are these guys are professionals, they're very, very professionals. As far as bombers, well, we don't have any bombers, we don't have any dedicated attack aircraft. But that said, we have another little thing that's kind of highly overlooked, and a lot of people look down on them and don't realize how valuable they are. Now, I got to sit in, it was a WW3 with known as the Coyote version, and basically it has a periscope mounted camera that uses FLIR, night vision, and it only had like Windows 95 to run the whole system, but that's all it needed because it was so effective. And this thing was excellent because it could raise up, it's basically like a land-based submarine almost, Now, even though it had the 25 millimeter gun, the idea behind the Coyote is surveillance. Okay, so you're going along, oh, you detect a brigade of tanks. Well, you call into the artillery, tell them where the coordinates are. They shoot, you move, you go somewhere else. And this thing is like, it's a forward-looking eye that a lot of people don't realize how valuable that the Coyote is. Is the labs problematic? Yeah, the labs have a problem. All military equipment has its Achilles heel. Biggest problem with the labs is rollovers. Because they're a top heavy vehicle, and the other second problem is they're a light armored vehicle, so they don't like the term light armored vehicle anymore in the military, I don't think, because people say, well, they're not going to do the job, so they call them personnel carriers instead. But they're still a light armored vehicle. So you have light armor, medium armor, that type of thing. Missile systems, again, we don't have a lot of variation on missiles, but what we do have, will take out any Russian equipment that could be thrown at us. The thing is do we have enough, and do we have it in the right places? Again, if you give a shoulder-held M72, recoilless rifle to, to 20,000 guys, divide them out, again, considering that it would be if one guy each plays one successful shot on an APC or a tank, say goodbye to the tank. You know what I mean? Like, it's not going to, once you blow the track off, that's it. You know what I mean? Not only will blow the track and the bogies, that thing's going to be down and sit and duck for a long time. And that's when your gunship helicopters and everything kind of, show up. So I think, we're underestimated as a military, but I don't overestimate. Again, the thing is that the Russians just have the numbers that, again, just the number of tanks. But it's the idea, could they get them to the shore? They probably could. I believe, in the short scale of things, the Russians would probably get the upper hand. In the long scale of things, I don't know if they would be able to hold it. Because it'd be like Canada or the United States trying to invade Russia. From the home base advantage, I don't believe one country could actually get a foot up on the other one. It would be very, very, very difficult. Again, for example, the Canadian Rangers here. don't look like much, but considering the numbers of them, the gun owners, considering the numbers of them, again, where does a soldier, enemy soldier, set up that they don't get shot at? Even if they kill the civilians 10-1, that means 10-1 they have to have at least a 3 million man army to be able to pull this off. Not to mention they have to fight other guys who are trained just as good or better than them. So again, an upper hand would be very, very, very hard to predict. Who would get the upper hand in the long run. So again, I think, like, again, our equipment is good. It's just in low numbers, and there's some areas that we're lacking. Definitely in the air defense and the ground attack. For example, if we had Apaches, I think that would be a better purchase than the F-35. I'd rather get 10 Apaches than one F-35. The F-35 to me is a waste of money, an obscene waste of money. I'd rather have 50 A-10s than 65 F-35s. The A-10 I think is a perfect airplane for Canada. It's rugged, it's all weather, it's a bomb truck, it's a flying tank. Just use the F-18s up high and the A-10s down low. You got the perfect combination and a recipe for disaster for the enemy. So that's the way I see it. Now that said, our CF-18s can be outfitted with rockets, bombs, a handful of missiles that we carry. AIM-9s, AIM-120s, that type of thing. So, it can be used. And then plus we have mortars and everything like that. So I think we'd be okay in the long run. In the short run, I think we'd have a big problem. But the thing is I think, the Russians wouldn't be able to invade Canada without massive losses to themselves. Even the Chinese with the, possibility of a 200 million man army that they have, it's the numbers can only get you so far, because we've already fought China, and the kind of how am I going to put this? The idea of swarm them with a human wave, take as many losses as possible, but see if you can win the battle. That the Russian philosophy is. It works very well to a point, but it doesn't always work. And Canadians in Korea, almost always outnumbered, usually still, killed, the North Koreans 15-1. Now, yes, the militaries are different. You have to understand that was the Chinese military of the day. Now, the new modern Chinese military, again, how many of them are as good as or better than, say, the Canadian military? I would say it'd be a 50-50 again. There's going to be the guys that are really good at what they do, and then there's going to be the rest that kind of got lost on the way to college or not really into it, or would rather serve in the military than serve a prison sentence for deserting the People's Republic of China, the PLA or whatever, People's Liberation Army. And we're going to liberate you by either making you cannon fodder or you're going to go to jail. So that's the way it is. Our military is voluntary here. It's not in China. So even with the Chinese, again, same thing. They would have the upper hand in the numbers. Their navy's huge, like Russia's. Again, you're talking about 200 boats, but when you look at the teeth side of the boats, I mean. Again, the Chinese, a lot of their stuff is older Soviet technology that Canadians are used to chasing around. We're used to chasing around older Soviet submarines. We've been doing it for decades. Why would we stop now? You know what I mean? And our stuff does find it. It doesn't mean they wouldn't get the upper hand. Again, being out, a navies. I don't think navies will last long anyway. Number one, as soon as a Navy ship is close to your shore, it's getting an artillery shell on the deck. Picture 20 howitzers just letting loose at once to a warship, unsuspecting warship. I'm sure their Skyguard system will shoot down 9 of the 10 shells, but the second 10 barrage of 10 shells, probably 8 or 10 of those are going to land on deck or airburst all the antennas and countermeasures off the deck. You know what I mean? Then on the third barrage, I think you're just going to make another, fish bed. You know what I mean? That type of thing. So it's now if the warship stays way off the coast, well then it's not of much use if it's that far out, right? So when we look at like the rocket boats and the stuff that the Chinese have, I think our boats, even though they're, again, almost everybody's Navy has 1970s boats in it, 1960s, 1970s, maybe hot rod like ours. Again, our boats were built in the 60s and the 70s, but they've been, if you looked at like the tribal class destroyers, they've been revamped about 2 or 3 times. Now, when we get our new Navy, how much more advanced is it going to be? But again, how much smaller is it going to be? So for it to be smaller, it has to be that much better. This is where I think the Russians are going to be more of a problem than the Chinese. The Chinese have more numbers, but the Russians tend to have they're slightly more advanced than the Chinese on average. Although both navies have extremely advanced stuff, their advanced stuff is in smaller numbers, where our navy is much smaller, but on average is more advanced. In our sonar and our tracking and stuff like that. Um, we have a pretty good military. Again, it's just mostly the numbers thing. But as soon as a war would break out or an invasion, I think you would have so many guerrilla fighters, like in any country. I mean, if you tried to invade China, look, you invade Iraq and Afghanistan, and these guys are, dumber than sticks living in caves with rusted out AKs, and you can't beat them. You know what I mean? So if the U.S. military, although a lot of it is propaganda that you're seeing over there, that they won't allow the war to end, you know what I mean? But even at that, you can't win a war there. There's, and they don't have hardly anything for weapons. So if that's like that there, I don't think it'd be much different here. Yeah, the average Canadian probably wouldn't want to fight. You know, I'm not going to pick on people from the city, but I'd say the more metrosexual type people, they're they wouldn't know what to do. But just as soon as you get out of just about any Canadian city, you're surrounded by rednecks, and they like to shoot at stuff. Kind of like the recruits, they like to blow shit up. It's like, yeah. So I'm not even saying that. I mean, think about, okay, you're a duck hunter, okay, and you just shot your fourth duck of the day. Your legal limit's done. Okay, and all of a sudden you see some Chinese and Russian paratroopers coming down. Got a box of shells. You're in your boat. You're well camouflaged. They're moving at the right place. Why not, eh? You picture that, you get a load of you steal buckshot to the crime coming up. Even that, like a lot of people, here's what I would, and this is what I envision of like a Red Dawn type of scenario. One guy with a semi-automatic 22, okay, sniping out, suppressive fire type thing, not big hitting power. Another guy with a single shot 22, just plinking away, and it'd be like a bunch of crickets. You can't tell where the hell they're shooting from. Then you got a guy with a 30-06 over here, and then when a bunch of guys come running at them, the guy with the pump action shotgun just kind of puts tons of lead down range. It's almost as effective as a machine gun, so next thing you know, everybody's blinded by buckshot, and then you got guys picking them off with 22s. And in the back, you hear a can of beer open, and right on, eh? That was fun. Let's do it again. I don't think it'll be like that, but you get the idea. So anyway, I guess I'm going to go on now. I know there's going to be a lot of people that know Russia will just crush Canada in 2 seconds. And then, of course, there's, again, there's the naysayers. Like, again, I think our military and Navy is much more unassuming. The biggest problem with our Navy is we can't find enough people to put, like, our boats are sitting empty because everybody's in offices. They're trying to get the people out of the offices. But again, our intelligence are pretty good. Our soldiers are pretty well trained. We have a lot of experienced soldiers. That's for sure. So I don't know. I wouldn't say I don't know who would win in the long run, because I don't think any nation could hold Canada. They'd have to wipe everybody out, and in the process, they'd take so many losses in that process. Plus, you have to understand, us being Canadian, would probably steal the tracks off your tank just as a prank. Imagine that, or just kind of like do other things like stick a whole bunch of bananas down the barrel of your T-72, that type of thing. You wouldn't expect it. It would be mean. It would be mean. It would be funny. Other things we do would be like, what else would we do? Let's see. Oh, I'm sure we could. I'm sure we'd come up with some sort of prank anyway. But yeah, so a war of pranks. We just annoy people until they'd go home. We don't want to fight them anymore. They're too annoying. Yeah, they're throwing beer bottles at everybody all the time. Yeah, pee. I know what we do. Put some fresh batch of Labatt's 50, pee in it. Put the caps back on. I did that to a couple of my friends when we were younger. We used to do that to like people we didn't like it. Well, I guess they weren't really friends. You'd pee in the bottle, you put the cap back on, and say, "Hey, I found a beer. Do you want it?" Yeah, I know it's gross, but when you're kids, I mean, it's war, right? You know what I mean? Hey, it's war. Deal with it. Yeah, the trauma. But anyway, all kidding aside, I don't know. I think our numbers are low. I don't think the Navy would last as long, but I think they would take a hell of a lot of ships with it. So, yeah, even at that, once your navies are wiped out, you really can't invade a country easily because if you have nothing to protect the supply ships, it would be almost impossible to get anything to the shore. Now, the military aspect of it, for example, the amphibious, landing vehicles that the Russians have, those things I think would make it to the shore the first time, but they would probably, there'd be an artillery shell falling on each one of these things as they were sitting, and then we'd pick off the tanks and troops as we go. And again, they would have to kill our military about 4-1. We'd have to kill their military 4-1 from a home advantage. So they got about a 1 million man military. Again, not including conscripts. Conscripts, it could be much more. But even at that, you have to understand from a home advantage, you're going to have a lot of volunteers that'll just be booby trapping and IEDing. I don't know. I can't see it being a successful venture for any one country. Although a lot of people could probably land in Canada and us not know about it. It's possible. It's possible. But I don't know. A major World War III kind of thing, I think Canada would probably fare out like the way it did in World War II. Uh, Impress people that didn't think that we had it in us, that type of thing. Just because I know how Canadians are, it's like I'm not just bolstering. And I know again I'm going to get the well you guys would be crushed in 2 seconds because you only have this and this and this equipment can do this. It's more about the man than it is about the machine. It always has been, always will be, no matter how good the technology is. But it's also a lot to do with the training. And again, our guys, although there's not enough of them, it's the training that really does make the difference. But I know our Navy is actually, those guys, by the time they're on a warship, they're pretty well trained. Yeah, so I guess I'll leave it at that. I'm sure people will have stuff to say about it. So, but I thought it was something that I should cover, and I guess that's about it. So, if you like this kind of content, there'll be a link down below to if you want to donate to the channel and help the channel out and make it bigger and better and all that stuff. And of course, you could check out my World War III updates page on Facebook. Go there. You could post links on stuff that's related to the geopolitical. If you follow my channel, you know that we are pretty much in the Cold War right now with Russia. And we will be shooting at the Russians over the Arctic at some point. So with that said, it's kind of give people a little bit of a check. Yes, there is a lot of areas where I think the Canadian military and Army and Air Force and Navy need to kind of, again, in the ground attack role stuff. But again, why have an A-10 when you can use a drone, right? But drones are fairly easy to shoot down for an actual army, such as the Russians. They would have no problem shooting down the drones, but you don't take any losses. So that's one, I think we'd probably start manufacturing tons of artillery, an artillery gun every 30 miles type of thing that has, 30-mile range. Our artillery is actually pretty good, so I think that would take care of a lot of that would even out the numbers a lot. But who knows? Next to that, rate, subscribe, share, comment, like, and I guess that's about it. So be true to yourself, be true to others. Always do the right thing. Have a great day, I got a warm beer for you. Oh, those sneaky, beady-eyed Canadians. God, bunch of hosers, eh? All right, anyway, have a good one. G'day, hey, hi, and welcome. Okay, is Canada ready for World War III? I guess the short answer is no. Nobody will be really ready for that. Now, this video is going to probably get some people, heated debate, I'm sure, going because of, perceptions, patriotism, and then of course there's just other other things to factor in. We're going to be talking basically a conventional war, not necessarily a full-out nuclear war, because no one's going to be able to really deal with that. But leading up to it now, with Ukraine about to, some say they will never get into NATO, but and there's a reason why they can't bring Ukraine into NATO right now, because that's instant war because of Article 5. Article 5 under NATO, basically, attack against one is attack against them all, meaning if they're with the U.S. propaganda and Canadian propaganda and British propaganda and everywhere else, from the EU, from the IMF, from the, what this really is about is, basically the EU, IMF, Rothschild bankers basically having control over, the Ukraine. But it's also about the strategy of basically NATO expansion into Ukraine. And with that, NATO expansion into Ukraine surrounds Russia's borders. It's also to destroy the manufacturing of weapons that Ukraine was making for Russia and other things. Plus, it's a war against the economy, the Russian economy, and stuff like that. So you get the idea. It's your typical war in all fronts. Now, with Canada here, okay, the battlefield between Russia, China, and the U.S. automatically defaults, whether we were a part of NATO or not, will automatically default Canada as the battleground. During NORAD in the 1950s, we had several interceptors up north known as the CF-100s. They were basically a Canadian-designed all-weather aircraft that it was kind of like a fighter interceptor type of thing, more of an interceptor than anything. It had good climb rate, although it was a straight-winged aircraft. It was about the only aircraft that NATO could rely on, because it was the only one that was had a 2,000-mile range and all-weather. So while other airplanes like the F-86 Sabre were better at dogfighting and stuff, the CF-100 was a really good patrol aircraft. And of course, at first it had rockets and cannons, like 20mm cannons, and then later on it would incorporate air-to-air missiles. And these things served right up to 1986. Okay, and by that time too, there was the frontline fighter was the CF-101 Voodoo. And then after that came the CF-18s, which we have now. But the thing is our newest airplane, our newest CF-18 is basically 30 years old, pretty much. So there's kind of problems. Now we have these Alpha jets now. We have about 100 of them on loan from France. I don't think we're going to outright buy them, but we also have about another 100, 100 CT 155 Hawks as well, which is a BAE British Hawk basically, and they can be used as like short range interceptors. Although they're not a high capability airplane in the sense of for ground attacks and mass payloads, they could be a hell of a dogfighter. And not to mention, we still have probably the CF 116, which was really basically an F5, but the Canadian variant of it, made by Canada Air. Canada Air made most of our combat aircraft, not all of them, but a good, like the F-86 Sabre. That was the most numerous jet we ever had, fighter jet we ever had in Canada, was the F-86 Sabre with about 1,800 of them. And then, of course, CF-18s now are about 120 to 140. There's a lot of them that, a few have crashed. Some of them are now parts planes. Many of them have been upgraded in 2003. But with that, we're still waiting on the next generation fighter. The problem is the replacement. The numbers keep getting lower as the technology goes up. The replacement numbers get lower. For example, when we do get the F-35, as controversial as that airplane is, we're replacing basically 140 airplanes with 65. So this is not good. This is not good at all. The Navy, we have 4 submarines, 2 of which that are actually being used. They do about 100 days of service every year. Although the Upholder class Victoria Upholder class submarines have been quite controversial. Again, now that they're working, they work quite well, but there's still a lot of problems. I mean, we took basically submarines that sat about a decade in salt water without maintenance, and pretty much had to rebuild them from the ground up. And there was also other problems, such as they didn't have the right torpedoes, so we had to we rebuilt the airplanes and had to kind of put in new torpedoes. We used to have aircraft carriers. We do not anymore. most of the old airplanes, such as the Voodoo and stuff like that, there's still there's still a few of them kicking around, but most of them are just air show. And same with the CF-104 Starfighters. Most of these things were basically most of them are now gate guards or have been pretty much chopped up. So the bulk of the Canadian Air Force is mostly helicopters and heavy lift. Like yeah, I believe at one point the numbers changed too, especially under the conservative government that we have now, which isn't technically a conservative government, but we'll call them a conservative government. Um, they're more socialist fascist in their policies, but they basically, in a nutshell, basically have done more for the Canadian military than any other government in history. The Canadian military has never had access to the training and equipment it's had. Now they have been making cutbacks for the 2015 budget, but even at that, we're upgrades on just about everything, plus the new equipment that we're getting. Um, the thing is with the heavy lift, most of our heavy lift are going to be uh, you know uh, C the C-130 Hercules, and stuff like that. Now with those, they're I think a better choice of airplane for Canada for a lot of reasons. Although they can't really move the extremely heavy stuff like tanks and stuff like that. That's where the the Globe Master basically is better for that type of stuff. Now, with that said, we if we're talking just taking on the Russians, I mean we're talking about a military that's about 4 to 5 times larger than us personnel wise. Okay. Now we're also talking about tanks and stuff where we have about 200 Leopard tanks of different variations. Although I say our tanks are superior in a lot of ways, we use like the 2A4, the 2A6. We have a lot of C2s left over that have been upgraded, so that they're not completely superior to the T-72s that will be outnumbering it. They're superior in a lot of ways, but with the upgrades, the Russians have, they got good stuff. It's not amazing stuff, but it's good stuff. But they just have so much of it that's where the real problem is. That said, so tanks alone, I think one on one, I would definitely put the hands down